Jet fuel prices in Asia have more than doubled. Asian airlines are going through considerable reshaping of their schedules, and it's particularly hard hitting for low cost budget carriers.
How severe has the impact of the Middle East conflict and closure of the Strait of Hormuz been on global jet fuel shipments?
Well, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the ongoing Middle East conflict is creating tremendous pressures on jet fuel shipments because a large part of global jet fuel shipments do come through the Strait of Hormuz in normal times. And that's, of course, been completely disrupted. Asia does have a lot of refining capacity, including for jet fuel in countries like China, South Korea, Singapore. But because of the shortage of crude oil supply, they are scrambling to try to find new sources of crude oil. But the outlook in the near term is for considerable disruptions to crude oil flows still impacting on Asian refineries. Some of the big refining hubs for jet fuel, which are China and Thailand, have introduced restrictions on exports of jet fuel to retain supply for their own domestic use, adding to further pressure on many Asian countries which had been quite reliant on imports of jet fuel from refineries in countries like China, South Korea, and Thailand.
How is this impacting Asian airlines?
Jet fuel prices in Asia have more than doubled since the outset of the conflict. This has had a very severe impact on Asian airlines because jet fuel does account for a very high proportion of operating costs. And now, with this huge increase in fuel prices, it's an even bigger part of their overall costs. So, the Asian airlines are going through considerable reshaping of their schedules. For example, in Vietnam, which has relatively low reserves of jet fuel, the airlines have considerably scaled back some of their flight schedules for the month of May. South Korean airlines have also been re examining their schedules and reducing flights. And it's particularly hard hitting for low cost budget carriers because their ticket costs are relatively low. And so, with this big increase in fuel prices, it's often difficult to pass that on to the customers. One region that's relatively less impacted is North America because the US has very large production of jet fuel domestically. They produce about 1 million barrels per day of jet fuel, but most of that is required for domestic consumption. And so, therefore, the US has relatively restricted ability in the near term to provide significant export assistance to other countries. The US does export jet fuel, so it has some ability to continue to provide jet fuel to, for example, the UK, EU, perhaps for some Asian countries, but this is not going to be a near-term fix for the global shortages in jet. Airlines are also having to cope with the risk that there may be fuel shortages in destination airports. And that's a particular concern for long haul routes. With Western Europe also facing potential fuel shortages in the summer months, there's a significant risk that long haul flights between Europe and Asia may be affected by fuel shortages if airlines cannot get fuel resupply at their end destination airports.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that aspect of it.
Because, short flights, you can carry enough fuel to come back. But
Mm.
if it's, long haul, obviously, there's no way to do that.
Right. And then, here we are looking at the summer travel season coming up. People would probably be planning their holidays, but with these fuel shortages in mind, how is this going to impact travel and tourism on a larger scale?
I think this is becoming a significant risk for summer airline travel, particularly on long haul routes, but also on budget carrier routes within the Asia Pacific, because, of course, the price of tickets for air travel is rising significantly. And also, airlines are cutting back on their flight schedules. This could significantly alter travelers' choices and also the costs for their air travel. So we could face considerable disruption to air travel this summer if this shortage of jet fuel persists into June and July.
So there's Asian refineries that are refining crude oil that has been transported through the Strait of Hormuz and refining it into jet fuel here in the Asia region. But then also there's jet fuel that's been refined that's been exported through the Strait of Hormuz. Is that correct?
There has also been disruption to Middle East supplies of jet fuel because Middle East refineries that export jet fuel have been impacted by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And there's also been war damage to some of the refineries in the Gulf. Therefore, a significant part of global jet fuel supply has been taken offline because of the conflict. And Western Europe and Africa are particularly dependent on imports of jet fuel from the Middle East. So they are particularly vulnerable to this loss of Middle East jet fuel supply.
Well, thank you, Rajiv. That's been a really good short look at the situation with jet fuel right now. Thank you very much.